At the end of the day, we don't need more barbecues. We need more chayalim. October 7th in the past year has changed everything. And when you have multiple fronts, multiple and ongoing fronts, at that point, you need a tremendous amount of manpower. And if you don't have enough, then the same people are going to be asked to do it again and again. If you really want to be part of the effort, at the end of the day, really being part of the effort means you're in a uniform patrolling the border. So I would say my small move here would be acknowledging progress. And my more dominant move would be we still really haven't addressed the fundamental problem.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Today I'm talking about something that I've spoken about before repeatedly, both on this podcast and on my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, namely the problem of a large number of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jews who receive army exemptions, usually, though not always, because they're learning in yeshivot. Why am I talking about this again? Because several events happened in the past few days, some very big and some quite small, which reminded me of the critical importance of this issue. The first and most tragic is the fact that since Thursday, we've learned of 19 IDF soldiers who have died in Lebanon and Gaza. 19. And as I was reading about some of them, I was struck by the fact that many of them have been serving in reserve duty for months at a time repeatedly, because Israel simply does not have enough soldiers to successfully prosecute this 7-front war without them. At a time like this, those who have true Klal Yisrael consciousness, a real sense of Jewish peoplehood, should be looking for ways to serve. Yet the head of the ultra-Orthodox Gimel Party, Yitzchak Goldknopf, is this week advancing legislation that will formally and legally exempt yeshiva students from army service. The confluence of these two events is sickening. In a much more positive sense, our son Yaakov came home Friday for a short break from military duty in the north, in Lebanon and on the Lebanese border. In the past 50 days, he'd come home for a total of about 15 hours. He hasn't been home for Shabbat in months. This is painful but understandable. This is the Tzav HaSha'ah, the call and command of the hour, when Israel is at war. The juxtaposition of his intense service, along with that of thousands and thousands of others, with the knowledge that thousands of Haredi students, whose Torah learning is supposedly protecting the IDF, are currently enjoying a 3-week vacation, and this after they had 3 weeks off just 2 months ago, is too obviously mistaken and wrong for me not to discuss it. Something else took place over social media when many people shared a picture of a Hasidic Rebbe who was, according to the caption, giving a bracha to an IDF soldier about to depart for the front. Many people commented that this was beautiful and that this scene demonstrates real progress. Other people felt that it was meaningless, that we shouldn't be celebrating the fact that a Rebbe was willing to give a blessing to a soldier as if that's meaningful, when his entire Kehillah, including many young men who could be serving in the army, are doing no such thing. The question then is whether we should be celebrating small steps. And this was another issue about which I wanted to give my opinion. Finally, I went to daven mincha in a local Haredi shul last week, a shul where I don't normally daven. After mincha was over, they said 2 chapters of Tehillim, but noticeably and obviously absent was a Misha Beirach for the soldiers of Tzahal. Now, I understand the reluctance to add new tefillot to our standard davening, but these are not normal times, and even though I wasn't surprised, I was pained that there was obviously no intention of saying this prayer, a Misha Beirach for soldiers, in this Haredi shul. This particular prayer contains nothing controversial, no statements about the state of Israel's place in Judaism or anything of that sort. It simply asks for the protection of the soldiers who are protecting us all. In fact, here is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs's translation. May he who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, bless the members of Israel's defense forces and its security services who stand guard over our land and the cities of our God, from the Lebanese border to the Egyptian desert, from the Mediterranean Sea to the approach of the Arava, and wherever else they are. on land, in air, and at sea. May the Lord make the enemies who rise against us be struck down before them. May the Holy One, blessed be He, protect and deliver them from all trouble and distress, affliction and illness, and send blessing and success to all the work of their hands. May He subdue our enemies under them, and crown them with deliverance and victory. And may there be fulfilled in them the verse, "It is the Lord your God who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to deliver you." And let us say Amen. There's nothing objectionable there. So why in too many places is it not being said? I could be mistaken, but I get the feeling that even mentioning the soldiers of Tzahal is, in some quarters, verboten. And that makes me both sad and angry. The Haredi community is a community which I respect. It's a community with many wonderful individuals who are friends of mine. And it is a community which the rest of the Jewish world can learn from, especially in its dedication to learning Torah. That's all true. I also think that the policy of the current Haredi leadership to avoid army service at almost any cost is a terrible violation of the Torah and a massive desecration of the divine name. And when there is this kind of violation and a Chilul Hashem, we need to make a macha'ah, call it out and protest again and again. So yes, I'm talking about it yet again. I think that this issue represents, in a real way, the test, the Akeidat Yitzchak of our time. And some people are simply failing this test. This is the most important issue in Orthodoxy today, so we need to talk about it extensively and establish clear and irrefutable arguments. I hope that this podcast will contribute to that ongoing need and that you will share it widely so that this message will be heard by those who need to hear it. 4 additional points. First, some people have asked me what I hope to gain from calling this out. I'm just preaching to the choir, right? To that I'll answer that I've been fortunate to have had communications with numerous listeners and readers. Some of them, indeed, agree with me already, but I believe that it gives them chizuk, encouragement, to be reminded that they're not alone. Others are undecided, and hopefully these conversations can help them get a better grasp on the issue in order to help them make an informed decision. And finally, some are members of the Haredi world, but who have said that conversations like these have caused them to rethink how they understand the issue. Second, some have said that by criticizing the Haredi world so vociferously, I'm causing serious damage. I think that's akin to blaming the victim, to saying that the problem isn't the behavior, but acknowledging that such behavior exists. And because we need to be honest and declare that this behavior is not the way of Torah, we cannot be cowed by those who say that it's better to sweep it under the rug. Third, someone asked on the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group on Facebook why Dati Leumi, or modern Orthodox people, need to criticize Haredim when there's so much work to do in our own communities. And it's true. There is plenty to criticize, and I hope that I do that on this podcast as well. But there's a difference between criticizing people for something that affects them alone and criticizing them when their actions have a direct impact upon others. The Haredi leadership's continued advocacy of blanket exemptions for anyone who nominally learns in yeshiva affects all of us and imposes burdens upon the rest of the Jewish population. It's unreasonable to demand that we ignore issues in the ultra-Orthodox sector when those issues force so many to assume additional risks and to be away from their families for weeks and months at a time. Finally, I want to be clear that I believe that some people learning Torah should indeed be exempt from the Israeli army. If the Jewish state gives military exemptions for other reasons, surely it should exempt our greatest Torah learners. The problem is that there are countless thousands who are not our greatest Torah learners, who do not learn all day long, and who are not cut out for yeshiva learning, and they too are getting army exemptions just because they nominally attend a yeshiva. We can disagree about where the line should be drawn and how many people should be given an exemption for Torah learning, but I think that anyone of goodwill must acknowledge that the current situation, where people who barely learn are also exempt, is a terrible wrong and a horrific violation of Jewish law and Jewish values. I was honored to welcome back Rabbi Yitzchak Blau to discuss this issue on today's Orthodox Conundrum, and we'll get to that conversation in a moment. First, Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, in 2024, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast. And JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Yitzchak Blau is a Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Oraita and also teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum. He is an associate editor of Tradition and the author of Fresh Fruit and Vintage Wine, The Ethics and Wisdom of the Agadah. He was a guest on this podcast in episode 209 when he and I discussed Haredi messaging in modern Orthodox institutions. Are you aware of what your children are being taught? Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, thank you once again for joining me on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It is great to be back.
I've spoken about the topic we're addressing today numerous times, both on this podcast and on my Substack. It's a topic which people may be getting sick of. People listening might say, you've talked about this already. Why do you need to keep talking about it? And that is a valid criticism. Nevertheless, I think it's important that we address it because there is such a serious problem in my mind. I'm not pretending to be an objective outside observer over here. I honestly believe that those people who believe that the Haredi community should have blanket exemptions are wildly mistaken and are currently involved in what's unfortunately a Chilul Hashem, a desecration of the divine name. We can't simply let it go and say, well, I've talked about that already. Moreover, as you and I are speaking right now, recording this on Sunday, October 27th, we just heard about a large number of soldiers in the past couple of days who've been killed in Lebanon and Gaza. It's terrible, and compounding the tragedy is the fact that so many of them have been serving for months and months and months simply because there are not enough IDF soldiers. When a community at large is largely trying to exempt itself en masse from sharing that burden, along with the fact that this very week, which is why this is acute right now, this very week, as I understand it, the head of the Degel HaTorah Agudat Yisrael Haredi Party, Gimel, Yitzchak Goldknopf, is advancing legislation to try and formalize this. It's something which we have to talk about, and we have to talk about why you and I believe this is not an acceptable state of affairs. So that's my introduction. And with that, why don't you present your basic argument about what you feel about this issue as an introduction for yourself?
Okay, so I would like to differentiate between this issue and other debates we might have with the Haredi community, in that our general impulse is to be more kinds of elu ve'elu, in the sense that different approaches have a validity to them. So let's say I am a big believer in reading Western literature, and the Haredi community is not so interested in George Eliot's novels. So it's hard to come with a moral critique. How could you not read George Eliot? No, George Eliot and be very fine people, very, very fine Jews. But in this particular issue, I do not think we should endorse an elu ve'elu approach. I think anyone who, as a community, has a blanket exemption to army service is a mistake of religious quality, of moral quality. And we should not talk about it as you can go this way, you can go that way. I think we should just say the Dati Leumi community is correct about this one. And that is my feeling. I imagine as the conversation goes, we'll discuss, I think there are a lot of levels to this. There's halachic sources, there's hashkafic sources, there's general ethical notions. And I hope we'll get to explore it on all of those three levels.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Blau. Let's talk about that distinction you made, however, between religious considerations and moral considerations. I think a lot of people in the religious world might question whether there is such a thing, saying that religious considerations and moral considerations are one and the same. And if our sources indicate that someone can do something immoral, and I don't necessarily mean in any given case, but for example, let's assume that avoiding army service is immoral. I'm throwing that out not to be contentious, but just working on that level. Let's say it's a moral problem at least. They might say, yeah, but what do you want? The Torah says that we can. Now, given that I don't agree that that's what the Torah says, that sort of is a bigger issue right now. But purely on a theoretical level, how do you distinguish between moral issues and religious issues when they might come to a head and might contradict with each other potentially?
Okay, that's a good question. Let me answer on two levels. One level is I do believe the majority position in our tradition is to actually recognize the natural morality, recognize an independent ethic. I think we've shown him say this all the time. I find it very interesting that often today it seems like, oh, the firmer position is to say there's no ethics besides what Hashem says. But the bulk of Rishonim didn't think that way, right? Rav Sadigo and Rav Yosef Albo, you get it in the Ramban al Torah, the Chizkuni al Torah. I mean, they'll say things like Cain is responsible for murdering Hevel because you're supposed to know not to murder people, not necessarily because he had a revelation from God about murder. Or Dor HaMabul is supposed to know not to engage in Hamas, not because of the Shevitz of Bnei Noach. They're simply supposed to know. So that's the first point I would make, that I think it's well within our tradition to have a notion of an independent ethic. But secondly, our tradition has some very general ethical commands, and we need to fill in the details of how to fulfill them, such as right, walk in God's ways, be compassionate like God is compassionate, or right, love your neighbor as yourself. Most of these things are not pinned down the way like the dimensions of a kosher lulav are pinned down, right? They're pretty open, and therefore we must use, ethical considerations in fulfilling them. So this strikes me as very much close to home in our case. And here I'll base it on maybe many of our listeners know, Rav Lichtenstein probably has the most important article about the Hesder movement, which appeared both in English and Hebrew. Those who want to find in English, it appeared in the 1981 tradition. And you could take a look there. All those traditions are online on the tradition website. And Rav Lichtenstein, I think, makes a very important point. A lot of discussion in this area is it a Mohammed mitzvah or not? If it's an obligated war in halacha, so it says in the Gemara, one has to go, even a chatan mechupato v'kala mechupata. Even a bride and a groom have to go. So it seems, oh, it's a Mohammed mitzvah, there's nothing to talk about. But Rav Lichtenstein says it's a mistake to make our entire focus whether it's a Mohammed mitzvah or not. Let's say it's not a Mohammed mitzvah for the sake of argument. Ribono Shalom, we're talking about, people giving up months and months to protect our people, risking their lives, and other people just, staying in the midrash, right? Where is your v'ahavta l'reacha kamoka? Where is your commitment to Gemilut Chesed? Right? One shouldn't need to have the category of Mohammed mitzvah to see that there's an ethical issue at work here. So again, I would say on both levels, Rav Khan. On the one hand, I do believe in ethics independent of halacha, but B, I don't think this is fully independent. It's a fulfillment of very general ethical mandates the Torah gives, and seems to me a no-brainer. Like, what is bigger act of than spending months in Lebanon defending your people?
Let me go down and drill down a little more on what you said a few moments ago about Elu ve'elu, this idea that two ideas can both be the words of the living God, which appears in Masechet Eruvin. Even though we may, in the end, say the normative halacha is like one or the other, they can both be valid Torah approaches. And you said in this case, you don't think that applies. Why is that the case? How do you determine, and obviously this is a very big question, but at least in this case, how do you determine that this situation is different from other cases where we can have a difference with the Haredi community, or anybody for that matter, about a particular halachic issue? And why in this case do you say, no, it's not true? Their situation is not an expression of Torah thought.
It's also a very good question. I would first say I could see how someone would disagree with me, because the bottom line is they do have knowledgeable rabbis who they are listening to. So if one thinks that by in itself makes your approach legitimate, then I agree. It's hard for me to criticize. Maybe it's a bit radical in my position, but I don't think that by definition makes both approaches legitimate. And I would say again, before, one has to ask oneself, what is the fallout from a position? And again, I'm sorry to reiterate it, but if we say the Haredi community is not going to study, Soren Kierkegaard and George Eliot, I think you're losing something, but it's hard to come with a strong critique, right? There's something deeply wrong with your community because you've never read Middlemarch. But here, I just think the fallout and the impact of the position that one can say we've got a problem here. I don't see, I think, unfortunately, great rabbis make mistakes too. And we could discuss why and how they got there if you want, historically. But here we have a place where I just think I'm sorry to say, the lack of sensitivity to the rest of Am Yisrael is just so blatant. So again, I don't think we should be quick to do so. Don't be so quick to identify a rabbinic psak, a rabbinic guidance as problematic, as illegitimate. It just seems to me in this case that the weight of the problem is so great that we should do so.
In that case, let's go on to what you just mentioned, the historical reality that underlies the current situation. Can you talk a little bit about how we got to this situation? Because, again, all my cards on the table, I fully agree with you. The fact that so many people halachically justify something which I find ethically terrible, as well as against the simple halakha as I see it and I understand it. I don't pretend to be the world's biggest expert, but I can't understand how someone can look at the sources logically and fairly and objectively and find in the end that, yes, yeshiva students en masse should receive an exemption. I'm using that term deliberately. I don't mean that no one should ever get an exemption. I don't believe that either. But I believe that this idea that anyone who essentially signs up for yeshiva should be exempt, I find that extraordinarily ethically and halachically problematic. How halachically, then, did we get into the situation historically? How did that happen?
Okay, so my answer is going to be a bit more sociological than halachic, but that's part of in the Jewish community as well. Okay, so as is well known, when Ben Gurion gave the exemption to about 400 yeshiva students, the assumption was that these are the last 400, that in 15 years, there aren't going to be any Haredim anymore, there aren't going to be any yeshiva, that secular Zionism will win the day, which just goes to show you, Rav Scott, that we should not trust sociologists for psak. They were definitely off on that one. Okay, so I think that was once very limited, grew into where thousands and thousands of yeshiva fellows get an exemption. So I think the original exemption was much more limited. Secondly, many people have pointed out that people who have a right or a privilege or a power don't tend to give it up so easily. So once you have a status quo of a yeshiva exemption, so it's kind of hard to rethink that. So we started with a 400 and then it became this widespread exemption. Okay, I would also add two more elements. One, the Haredi element community, to its credit, right, doesn't change so easily, right? That's part of what they are. They're a conservative community, reluctant to change, which obviously has its pluses. It could be, we could say a bit of elu v'elu. Maybe other communities are too quick to change, but at the same time, it's also a problem. The last thing I would say is that many Haredi communities have a bit of sense of being under siege, that their worldview is being attacked from the outside. Now, there are elements of truth to it. Like sometimes critics really are unfair to the Haredi community. But at the same time, I think given their strength and their political clout, at this stage, the major focus on being under siege is actually not really true to the reality, right? If right now, for example, the Haredi community controls whether the government stands or falls, that's hardly this powerless minority being persecuted. So I would say, I think sociologically, we've got the starting with 400 students after World War II. We've got the resistance to change. We've got the sense of being under siege. Well, maybe I'll throw a fourth thing in there. Now it occurs to me. We also just didn't really deal with halacha of warfare for, over 1,500 years, right? More than that. So we're not really working with an ongoing live tradition that we've updated, that we've addressed. So there's almost a sense of starting from scratch, right? We don't really have a Hilchot Milchama that's been developed. So I think all those factors have led us to where we currently are in terms of the Haredi draft exemption.
In that case, can you try for a moment to put on your, I guess, theoretical cap and try and explain from the Haredi perspective, what is their halachic justification? And then if I can ask you to go further to say why you think it doesn't hold water.
Is it okay if I do the hashkafic justification first?
Please.
Okay, so something else I'm researching now, which I find very interesting. I mentioned before that most Rishonim believe in an independent ethic. I'd like to now point out something else that has changed over Jewish history. Right now, there's a very strong ideology that human effort, hishtadlus, doesn't really create results. It is really God who creates results. Nonetheless, for one reason or another, one has to put in some effort. This is a position advanced in the Mesilat Yesharim, in Michta Melio from Rav Dessler. It is a very popular position in the yeshiva world today. I think, again, if one went to the Rishonim, one would discover that this is not the case. The Rishonim, by and large, believe that we live in a natural order. And even though God will step in for tzaddikim and maybe for Rishayim, but for the most part, natural order reigns. And our efforts within that natural order really make an impact. And I know someone's going to say, oh, that's just, Rambam or Nevuchim, only like radical rationalists. But that's actually totally not true. You get the same thing in the Iran, in the Abarbanel, in the Ramban, in Rav Yosef Albo. I'll just mention two brief examples. Okay, so Rav Yosef Albo in his Sefer Karim, this is Mamar Dalid Perek Vav. He starts out, here's the first sentence. Hacharitzut, diligent. Vishtadlut, effort. V'hechrichin, it's necessary. L'chol davar min hapelot enoshiot. But it's helpful, meaning it's what. And he goes on to explain, I'm not going to read the whole passage now, that in most circumstances, our diligence is what gets things. Okay, and even the Ramban is fascinating because the Ramban, at the end of the bow, is often cited for the other position. But if anyone looks at the Ramban in Eov, in Perek Lamed Vav Pasuk Zayin, he says that tzaddikim have a very acute providence to protect them, and Risha might have an acute providence to punish them. But most people, he says, are mizumanim lemikrim. They're left to accidents. They're not safe from damages. If you walk in darkness, asher nefilato krova, you're likely to fall. What will prevent you from falling? If you walk slowly, right? And then he says, Rov ha'olam min. This is the majority of the world, meaning the majority of the world is not getting special providence to be protected or punished, but the majority of the world is walking in darkness. You want to not fall. That's how the world works. So I think it's kind of remarkable. I really wonder what caused the shift from a sense of human effort making the real difference to a sense of human effort being this kind of, pro forma tax we pay, but it doesn't really produce results. I think the result of this split is obvious. Meaning, from a shkafic perspective, who is really protecting Am Yisrael? So if I think like Rav Yosef Ramban, so I would say people who are now, uniform in Gaza and in Lebanon, they're the ones protecting Am Yisrael. We are, for the most part, working with our efforts within the natural order. But if I think like the Mikveh Milyo and like Mesilat Yesharim, I might say, well, God is really doing all the work anyway. And therefore, those that are doing particular mitzvot that are pleasing to God, they are providing protection. So at that point, I think it's a little bit easier to understand how a Haredi thinker could justify his position. So in my mind, we could discuss a little bit more if you want. I think we should go back for various reasons to the position of the Rishon. It's really our efforts that produce the result. And at that point, someone who's not putting in the effort is not contributing in a profound way to the cause of protecting Am Yisrael.
One of the things that I found very problematic on a personal level has been my questioning whether the people, or at least some of the people who maintain this position that our efforts don't matter, actually believe this. And the reason that I wonder it is, number one, based on the, I believe, relatively flimsy sources that say the Torah protects in an active way. For example, the Yerushalmi that says that the Naturi Karta, the true guardians of the city, there it says it's not actually learners of Torah, it's actually teachers of children, but let's even assume, let's broaden it to learners of Torah, it's still the teachers of Torah in that city. In fact, it's deliberate. It's obvious in that case that Rabbi Yehuda and his students are saying the people who are protecting are the people in the city. And if this were taken seriously and literally, then rather than go and decamp to yeshivot far away from the border, those who are trying to protect Klal Yisrael should, by all rights, moved closer to the borders where people are fighting if they actually believe that this was helping. But we see over and over that's simply not happening. How many yeshivot have opened in Sderot and Ofakim and the kibbutzim near Gaza since the Gaza war started? I'd venture to say close to zero. How many have opened up in the border near Lebanon? I'd venture to say close to zero. That shows that they don't actually believe it. Moreover, the very fact that I just saw on Shabbat, there were flyers out about voting in the American elections released by American Haredi Rabbanim and Rosh Yeshiva. That applies even more so in Israel, where they say, make sure you vote, make sure you vote. Well, why is voting any different than fighting in a war? If our hishtadlus, if our personal effort is irrelevant, then you shouldn't have to vote. It doesn't matter. What we need to happen will happen regardless. I'm not sure why you can say that when it comes to fighting, there, it has nothing to do with the actual people driving the tanks and holding the guns and flying the airplanes. There, it's about people learning yeshivas and me'er sharim. But when it comes to voting, when it comes to electoral politics, everyone should be mevatel Torah, take off a day from yeshiva to go and vote. To me, the hypocrisy is so glaring, it's very difficult to take it seriously, to think they actually believe what they're saying.
I fully agree. I think we could critique the Haredi attitude in two ways, and one would be more sharp than the other. One would be what I said before, that maybe they really believe it, that Torah is what protects. I just think it's incorrect. It's incorrect hashkafically. It's incorrect empirically. I think even empirically, we notice that people who try harder do better. It is true that hishtadlus matters. But let's leave aside. So that's number one. Secondly, you said, I definitely think I can be very critical of the Haredi community. Maybe I'll try a softer word. Instead of hypocrisy, I'll say there's a deep inconsistency. Meaning, as you're saying, they don't seem to really function that way in other areas. I believe the Haredi community in Israel actually has a whole developed system regarding medical issues, how to find the best doctor. I don't remember the fellow's name. Maybe you know that there's like somebody in Bnei Brak that you go to who directs you to like the best heart surgeon and the best cancer specialist. So it's kind of amazing. I think that's nothing. Right? Let them find the best doctor and proceed. But that doesn't sound like a community that the hishtadlus doesn't matter. But it seems like, no, we're functioning within the natural order. And the best doctor gives you a better chance than just a decent doctor. So it's kind of funny that, just when it comes to military service, there we could kind of outsource all the hishtadlus. We don't have to do anything. I think that is a deep inconsistency. You mentioned yeshiva moving. I'll mention another factor that gets said. What about, Beinas Manim? Like, if Torah is what protects us, so how could you have a Beinas Manim break during war? Meaning the people in Miluim don't have Beinas Manim, right? Because they think every moment counts, every day matters. So why wouldn't you say, I know it's hard for yeshiva guys, but harder things in the world than losing vacation one year. And, you could sit down a little bit, maybe during Beinas Manim, but surely there should be a sense that we need our Torah to protect us. So again, I'm fully with you here. Either the Haredi community really believes it's wrong, or perhaps a little bit worse, maybe there's a deep inconsistency and even on some level hypocrisy going on in the community.
The issue of Beinas Manim is one that I've spoken about numerous times and written about, and it's a very personal issue for me. Like many of us, we have kids in the Army. I have a son in the Army. I have a son-in-law who's going back to the Army. And people have often written back to me, people who want to defend the Haredi system by saying, well, doesn't your kid get a furlough? In this particular case, I could say, are you kidding me? He spent the past 50 days entirely either on the Lebanese border or in Lebanon. He actually came home, thankfully, right before Shabbos. We have him here for 3 days. But before that, he was in from before Slichot until Yontif. He was up there without a furlough, not at all. And of course, he's not going to get a furlough. We're in the middle of a war, a hot war, a serious war. The idea that somehow during that exact same time, the heat of the war in Lebanon, this is not as though, and even if it were going on for a year, I don't really care, but this has been going on literally for a month, from basically Rosh Hashanah until now. And that's exactly when so many people are taking off. I have a very hard time remaining objective and remaining emotionally uninvolved in this particular conversation and to say, yeah, my kid gets a furlough. He's been sleeping in a tank. He couldn't sit in a sukkah until the last day of Sukkot because he was sitting in a tank. He was underneath the tank the entire time. He couldn't hear Tkiyah Shofar except over the tank radio because he was in Lebanon. Literally, he was in Lebanon. And for people to say, well, everyone needs a break. It's like, no, I don't think everyone needs a break. I think you do need a break. But if you actually believe your own PR, if you actually believe your own idea that we are protecting Klal Yisrael, now's not the time for a break. Now's the time to cancel the break and move it to when the war is over. Or perhaps, if you really need it, fine, on an individual basis, petition. Okay, this guy needs a break. He's been learning really hard and he's tired and he needs fine, take a week off. This other person, you need a couple days off, go home for Shabbos, no problem. The rest of you, of course you're going to stay in. The fact that this hasn't changed, not to mention the fact the idea of 10 weeks of vacation every year is more than almost any other people would get. And Beinas Manim is 10 weeks a year. Somehow people who are learning need so much vacation, I just find it egregious and very, very upsetting.
I like to jump on that because I think there's another element here that's important. And I'm going to apologize, Meirosh, to my Haredi friends. But beyond the position that the Haredi community takes, I think several public statements of their politicians and leaders are just outrageous. So the one more thing I would ask is, at least if you take the position, have the decency and the sensitivity to talk about this in a very moderate way. I'll just use three examples. The politician you mentioned before, Golknoff, said at one point that it's harder to be in the Beit Midrash than on the front. Now, I don't think anyone who has a child or a relative or a neighbor's kid on the front could possibly say that. It shows you like the problem, either the isolation of the Haredi community or just the ideological frenzy of the community. It's just wrong. I'm in the Beit Midrash every day. It is not particularly difficult. Okay, I really enjoy it. This is not the same as being on the front and being afraid of being shot and living in difficult physical conditions, by being away from family. It's just outrageous that he said that. Secondly, there was a rabbi who said that should be thankful to Tzal like we're thankful to garbage men, which is just incredibly insensitive. Now, I have nothing against garbage men. Let us be thankful to them. But surely there is some sense that Chayalim are doing more for us than the average profession. Not just garbage men, they're doing more than the lawyers are doing for us. Right? Where is some sense of gratitude towards what the Chayalim are doing? Thirdly, a rabbinic statement that nobody really wants to go to the army. They just do it because they're forced, which is also absurd. Right? Think about all the Jews, both secular and religious, who flew back from abroad after October 7th. No one was forcing them to do so. They wouldn't have faced sanctions if they had not. Even today, most people don't realize, like, if you really don't want to show up for Miluim, you just don't show up, right? There's really a coercive element regarding Miluim. So idealistically doing their thing at tremendous personal cost, and to be told that, oh, you're really just doing it because you have to. So I would say to the Haredi community, okay, let's leave aside that I think that you are wrong about the issue, but talk with sensitivity. And what frustrates me more, okay, no one can control all your spokespeople. People are going to say insensitive things from every camp, but at least come out with a public rejection, right? The community seems incapable of rejecting any sentence said by a rabbi in a public forum, right? So that rabbi was wrong, and we do believe that they're being idealistic about it. Where is that voice within the community?
I mean, that last point about they're doing it only because they're forced to. I don't even understand exactly what that critique is. Let's say that's true. Let's even assume that they're doing it because they're forced to. What is Ol Malchut Shamayim, the yoke of heaven that we take on, other than there are some things I don't want to do, but it's my responsibility and I do it. Let's assume that none of those soldiers want to be there. They're there because they feel it's their responsibility. Does that take away anything from their service? The fact that they say, I don't want to do this, but I have responsibility to the people of Israel, to the land of Israel, and to the God of Israel? I don't even understand the critique.
I agree with you. I think what the rabbi meant is they're forced by the government. I mean, not by a sense of responsibility, just because they don't get in trouble vis-a-vis the Medina. Again, I think he's totally wrong, but I suspect that was the line.
Okay, well, there's a lot to talk about here in this as well. I want to make something clear about Blau as well, which is that I don't have animosity towards any individual. When I spoke to Rav Chaim Soloveitchik a few weeks ago, he and I emphasized that as well. There's nothing on a personal level to any given person who subscribes to this philosophy. I know people who are good friends of mine who believe this, and they're good people. I think they're sorely misguided, but I don't have personal animosity to anyone. I do have some animosity to the Haredi leadership that's been saying some of these ideas and advancing this legislation and advancing these ideas and this philosophy. But on an individual level, it's not a personal thing. And I also will add that I respect the Haredi community for a lot of what it accomplishes that the Dati Leumi, the national religious community, sometimes fails in. I think its dedication to learning Torah is much stronger And I think that we should admire that. It's dedication to tzniut, however that's designed, however that's defined. Maybe perhaps I may not agree with the way they define tzniut, but having it as a value as opposed to dumping it, which sometimes happens in certain sectors of other religious communities, I think that's something we also have to note, is at least they care about it on some level, even if I think they may implement it in a way that is wrongheaded. There are good things in the Haredi world. I'm not trying to trash the Haredi world. I will say, when it comes to this particular issue, I believe, and I don't know if you'll agree with this, that the ethical problem, the moral problem, and the religious halachic problems are so obvious, so bolate, they stick out so much that what we have here is a desecration of the divine name, a Chilul Hashem, which people will be talking about in hundreds of years, putting their hands to their forehead and saying, how could it be? How could it possibly be that the people who presented themselves as the most Torah-based Jews, the most religious Jews, the frommest Jews, somehow failed in this massive test in a way that the Jews who are ostensibly less committed to Torah did not? And that's what I mean. It's not adversarial towards the Haredi community in general, but on this particular issue, it very much is adversarial towards them because of what I believe is a real desecration of the divine name.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. I'll just mention very briefly, I was at a wedding recently, and a friend of mine who wanted to kind of give a more positive spin, Haredim are tinok shenishbas. I mean, they grew up in a world where this is assumed, and therefore you have to have mercy and compassion for them. So I would just point out that in other areas of life, we do say that, but not always. Like, let's say, I don't know, we meet someone who grew up in a fascist or communist society. So it's true, we'll give them a little slack because that's how they were educated. But on some level, we'll still fault the society in us, and as a collective level. Maybe we'll fault the leadership more than can file. That might be legitimate. But I don't think Tinuk Shenishba could be this, massive exemption from critique. And you'll challenge me, so why will I apply it to secularists? So I might say I'll apply it to secularists on an individual basis, but as a collective community, let's say we decide that the secular West has lost the value of family, right? So if we decide that, that's a good critique. And I wouldn't just say, well, they're all Tinuk Shenishba, so the critique falls away. The critique very much remains in place, whether or not we have the Tinuk Shenishba formula to plug in.
Somebody said to me that when I say that there's no objective way to read the sources and truly believe that there should be mass exemptions for Torah students, he responded on my Facebook group, there are some people who would say the same thing about you. There's no objective way to read the sources, and you're being subjective, that they shouldn't receive it. And I think that's an absurd way of reading it. Admittedly, I know I'm subjective. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an objective reader because there probably isn't such a thing. Everyone brings their own experience, their own ideas to a text. At the same time, I think it's quite clear. It's very difficult to look at the actual text and somehow come away, again, speaking subjectively, but I can't see how someone can objectively come away from our text looking at Torah as an organism, the entire body of Torah literature, halachic literature, and somehow say anyone who signs up for yeshiva should be exempt from the Israeli army given the way it is right now. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah. Let me talk about two sources, one used to obligate and one used to exempt. So the most obvious way to obligate would be indeed to say that we're talking about a milchemet mitzvah, an obligatory war. As is well known, the Rambam in Hilchot Melachim says beyond waging Amalek and beyond conquering Israel from the seven nations, there is a milchemet mitzvah, Ezrat Yisrael miyad tsar, to save the Jewish people from an enemy, right? When the Jewish people are in physical danger. Now, let's say not everybody in halachic history agrees with the Rambam. It's a pretty important position, right? Rambam is no minor figure. And here you have one of the most important mitzvot and you're obligated, right? So for the sake of argument, let's even call it a chumrah. Sounds like a pretty good chumrah, right? To fulfill this mandate of milchemet mitzvah. That's in terms of mitzvot in favor. And again, as I said before, I would go with Rav Lichtenstein here. I think we should do it also just because of ahavta l'reacha kamocha, beyond the parameters of milchemet mitzvah. But a good case could be made that it is a milchemet mitzvah. Okay, let's talk about one of the classic sources used as an exemption. So the Rambam at the end of Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel has this model of somebody who is fully dedicated to spiritual pursuits and therefore gets an exemption from practical responsibilities. And you see now that anybody could declare themselves in that category. and then would not have to go to war. Because I should say it starts with the Lo Shevet Levi Bilvad. Don't think it's just the Levites. Anyone from a different tribe could join the club, as it were. So I'm just going to mention a number of problems with that reading of Rambam. Okay, first of all, it contradicts a very elaborate Rambam in Hilchot Talmud Torah. I mean, not about war, but about economic responsibility. That many of you know, the Rambam was very adamant about not using Torah as means of financial support. And I want to be honest, in theory, the Rambam is a problem for coal guys and maybe even for me and you. It's not obvious that I could teach Torah and get a salary according to Rambam. I mean, various leniencies have been developed over time, but the Rambam is pretty strong. Look at his language there in Hilchot Talmud Torah about using Torah as a source of parnasa. So Shemitah v'Yovel seems to indicate that's fine. I could throw off the yoke of economics if I have this spiritual single-mindedness. But that doesn't seem to be the Rambam's position. So that already should make me doubt Shemitah v'Yovel, right? It is much more developed in Hilchot Talmud Torah, his opposition to such a thing. Okay, secondly, as Rav Lichtenstein also points out, the placement is kind of interesting. If the Rambam meant this as an exemption, it should be in Hilchot Malachim. He has a place where he discusses the laws of warfare. What's he doing in Shemitah v'Yovel? That's an odd place to put the exemption if it's really halakhically binding. Thirdly, it's well known that the Rambam did something very beautiful. At the end of the 14 books in the Mishnah Torah, most of them end on a hashkafic flourish. Right? The Rambam knew, don't end on like a technical halachic detail. And it's a little bit of an inspiration. And that's beautiful. But that might mean that they're not meant to be taken as technical law. They are meant to inspire people. Here's an inspiration. Even if you're not from Shevet Levi, you could be a tremendously pious person, dedicated with a certain single-mindedness to Avodat Hashem. But that's not a psak, right? So when you put all that together, I even add a fourth factor. Fourthly, let's say it is a psak. The Rambam describes a really single-minded level of functioning. How many people today can say they really function that way? They're really at that level of Kodesh Kedushin and would merit that exemption. Especially some we haven't even mentioned yet, that how in the world does the Torah apply to the creative guys who are actually not learning? And we didn't even get to that yet. But now think about the following 4 points. Here's one of the major sources for the exemption. A, it contradicts a much more extensive Rambam in Talmud Torah. B, it's not in the place it should be location-wise. C, it's in a context where the Rambam tends to do more agadic flourishes than halakhic detail. 4, even if we ignore all the previous 3 things, how many people really meet that level of commitment? So I admit it's true what you said before. We're all subjective, but I would say we're all subjective to some degree, right? We should not overdo it. Professor John Levinson has a line I like a lot. He once said, we all have biases, does not mean all we have are biases, which I think is a very good line, right? It's true. I'm not the most objective person in human history, but I still think there's a stronger reading and a weaker reading, and we can argue about that legitimately.
I want to add to what you said about that Rambam, Hilchot Shemitah v'Yovel. In addition to everything you said, with which I agree, I think it's also important to note several other details which seem to be forgotten. Number one, the Rambam does not mention there at all about learning Torah. He says knowing God and dedicating your entire life, almost a monk-like existence. The fact that it doesn't say people who are learning Torah is, if you're taking it literally as a halachic as opposed to a shkafic idea at the end of Sefer Zraim, if it is halachic, you'd think that he would say anyone learning in yeshiva. That would be the obvious thing. And Ikar Chaser Min HaSefer, the most obvious point, is not there at all. Beyond that, it also says someone who does this permanently. If you are learning in yeshiva, but you plan when you're 50 years old, to go off and get a job, this does not apply to you. This is someone who plans to do this until the day he dies or the day she dies. If that's not true, then it simply does not apply by the Rambam's own words. Moreover, it's also worth noting that the Rambam doesn't mention in that last halacha that you are exempt from military service. He says that you are like Shevet Levi, which in the previous halacha means you can't take possession of anything. That's what he says, lo zochin. You can't take possession. You can't inherit. There's all sorts of things that are implied. Why would it be, if the Rambam was meant literally, that the people who are learning yeshiva also are not allowed to basically own property. They can't. But the Rambam says that's what it applies to. So if we're going to take the Rambam literally, saying that what appears in the first halacha applies to the second halacha, it can't just be they don't go out to war, which he does say. It also should be they're not allowed to take possessions. They're not allowed to inherit. Does the Rambam say that people who are like Shevet Levi also should get maser? They should get the portion for Leviim? Does anyone really believe that that's what it means, that now the people who make themselves into a type of Shevet Levi are allowed to take the portion for Leviim as well? No one says that. So the idea that somehow we take this Rambam literally and apply only certain parts of it, namely the one about war, and none of the rest of what he talks about, to me seems, I'm not going to use the hypocritical word, but a misreading of the Rambam.
Scott, I like your 2 points very much. I just want to add one note to your first point. If I recall correctly, the Rambam's language is kol echad ve'echad mibai olam. Is that right?
Kol ish ve'ish mikol ba'ei olam.
So people have pointed out that language includes non-Jews also, right? Maybe a Gentile could be
explicitly.
So that's great, but that makes your point even stronger. Like, these might be great Gentiles. They're probably not, in the base learning minchas chinuch. They're probably out there doing chesed, and maybe they're studying Tanakh, but they are not like, Talmud Torah and Kollel. So clearly the Rambam's image here is not a real student. It's just someone who's tremendous dedication to the best causes.
Let me ask about another common, maybe even a more common line, which I've heard repeatedly. When I've mentioned this, that I believe that the sources simply don't demonstrate at all that people who are learning should be exempt, at least not en masse. People will say, yeah, but the problem really isn't that. That's what they say. The real problem is the spiritual danger. Yes, technically, there's no exemption or potentially no exemption for people who are learning per se. The problem is the Israeli army is a place of shmad. It's a place of heresy. It's a place that tries to make people not religious. I'm simply repeating the argument, not agreeing with it. It's a place which is spiritually dangerous in many ways. I just mentioned my kid who couldn't hear shofar in Rosh Hashanah. That's spiritually dangerous. He could sit in a sukkah or hold a lulav and esrog on sukkahs. That's spiritually dangerous. He may be with irreligious people who try to convince him not to be religious. That's spiritually dangerous. He may be in mixed company in certain situations. That's spiritually dangerous, etc., etc. That issue is a different question, and I'm wondering how you would respond to someone who would say that. Fine, the sources don't say that you're exempt because you're learning Torah. However, you can't put yourself into a religious, dangerous situation.
Okay, so it's a good question. Let me say as follows. First of all, I do think the Ilumi world has provided a model where it is possible to go to the army and remain religious. Now, again, there is a certain amount of dropout. There's no denying that. And there are challenges. It would be foolish to deny the challenges. But there is a basically successful model. So once there's a basically successful model, I think it becomes much harder to argue that that's the reason not to go. I will add, obviously, there's a certain amount of dropout in the Dati Lumi community, but just be careful. Don't identify dropout with army service. Right? A lot of the kids are already heading towards not being from before they've enlisted for a moment. Right? So it's true. It's something that our community has to address. It would be a mistake to say, if we just didn't go to the army, then problem goes away. So I think, A, we have a successful model. B, Rav Chaim Navon in Makari Shon once had the following line, which I liked a lot. He said, I don't understand. It's also physically dangerous, and yet we go. Right? Meaning there's certain things you have to do, even though they come with a risk. Right? Let's say, it comes with a risk to do kibbutz avim for whatever reason. Right? No, most of us would tell you have to take that risk and do kibbutz avim. So if you have to be in physical danger to wage war and defend Am Yisrael, so maybe you have to take on spiritual danger also. I thought that was a good point. The last, it's fair that the creative community might say it's more difficult for us. We're more used to being isolated. We have more needs. But I will say, sometimes people argue, it's upsetting to me when people say this, that the army's not really willing to accommodate the Haredim. First of all, they have tried to accommodate them. They've made special units for the Haredim. Granted, it didn't always meet Haredi needs 100%, but that's life. Life is about compromising, right? I think sometimes we think, they have to make all the compromises, we have to make none. There's no reason why that should be the case, but even for the general religious community. I don't know how often we focus on the fact that, Ben Gurion agreed to make, and Rav Goren gets up for this, take the army Shomer Shabbos and Shomer Kashrut. But if you think about numbers in the beginning of this state, that was not obvious at all, that the army would be Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Kashrut, and yet it is. And is it at the standard of, Mahadran? That's no. But I would say that's part of the give and take of communal functioning, right? Everyone tries to do something so that we could work together. So again, I freely admit that Tzahal will have to work a little bit harder to make Haredi friendly units, harder than they have to work, let's say, to make Dati Lumi friendly units. But at the same time, I don't think it's possible for the Haredi community to say, we're going to get everything we demand. Every single thing we demand, right? Gemara Seder, Musar Seder, Mahadran and Mahadran, they never see a woman. Right? At some point, something's got to give a little bit, right? So again, there's a little bit more sympathy you could have to this claim. But as I said, things that are really important, you have to take a certain amount of risks. We have a successful model out there. And at some point, everyone has to compromise a little bit.
My response to that is often to quote the Agadata that appears in Masechet Brachot, where there's a dialogue presented between Yeshayahu HaNavi and Chizkiyahu HaMelech. Yeshayahu appeared before Chizkiyahu HaMelech and said, "You're going to die." And Chizkiyahu said, "Why?" He was a tzaddik. He was one of our most righteous kings. Yeshayahu said, "Because you have not engaged in pru urvu. You did not have children. That's a mitzvah." Chizkiyahu said, "Yes, because I see with Ruach HaKodesh, I see with prophetic insight that my child is going to be a terribly wicked person." To which Yeshayahu HaNavi answers, "With these hidden things of the Lord, what do you have to do with them?" In other words, you have a mitzvah. Your job is to keep the mitzvah. And yes, there are spiritual dangers. This is more than a spiritual danger. It's prophetically confirmed. This child's going to be bad. And he's going to do terrible things. He was a murderer. And yet, at the same time, you have a mitzvah. And you are not able to exempt yourself from mitzvah because of a spiritual fear. And that was more than a fear, as I say. At that point, Chizkiyahu said, "Fine, I agree with you. Let me marry your daughter. I will then hopefully have kids. And let's hope and pray that our joint merit will mitigate the decree that I saw through Ruach HaKodesh." To which Yeshayahu replied, "No, it's too late." Chizkiyahu said to him, "Get out of my room. It's never too late." And he davened, and Hashem granted him 15 additional years of life. And to me, that Agadata, and admittedly it's not a halachic Gemara, but I think it presents a very important idea, says two things. First of all, that when you have a mitzvah, you can't say, "Yes, but it's spiritually dangerous." It doesn't matter. You have to do what you have to do and let God worry about the consequences. I think that same idea appears in the pasuk that we read a few weeks ago, Hanistarot Lashem Elokeinu. The hidden things belong to God. V'haniklo, the revealed things, Lanu Ulavanenu Ad Olam. That's what belongs to us and our children forever. Lasot Ekol Divrei HaTorah, to do what God commands in the Torah. And the fact that it's spiritually dangerous, really, that's a concern, but it's not your primary concern. And the second part is that spiritual danger is real, and therefore we have to daven. And in the end, Chizkiyahu did daven, and he was granted that he at least was able to live, even if the spiritual danger was still acute. There means that nothing is etched in stone. There always is the possibility of that spiritual danger being mitigated, and that takes our effort as well. Our effort both physically to create Haredi units that will be appropriate for their particular needs, as well as to daven and to do whatever we can to prepare our Haredi soldiers for that. To me, often the problem is, Rabbi Blau, that this rejectionism we see from the political echelon, as well as often the Haredi religious echelon, not saying, how can we make it work, but let's find reasons that it won't work. And that's what's so frustrating to me.
Yeah, I fully agree. And great use of one of my favorite Haggadot. Way to go.
Now, another thing which I want to raise, another issue that I want to raise, is a picture that was going around on social media a few days ago during Chol HaMoed. And different people had different reactions to this picture. It was a picture of a Hasidic Rebbe, presumably at a Simchat Beit HaShoeva somewhere in Israel, at a party on Sukkot. And he was, according to the caption, I don't know what was actually said, but according to the caption, this Hasidic Rebbe was giving a bracha to an important person in the IDF who was about to go to the front. And the Hasidim are standing behind it. And people were often saying, as this was passed around social media, "This is so beautiful. Oh, what a beautiful picture. There is hope. We can see the future," because enough said. My perspective is, what's so beautiful? Because what, they didn't throw him out? The Rebbe was willing to give an IDF soldier a bracha, like that should be a chiddush? My own personal opinion. Again, I don't know what actually happened. It could be this did happen. I would hope that the Rebbe would say, "Please give me a bracha. You're defending Am Yisrael. I need a bracha from you as much or more than you need a bracha from me." I was not happy with the reactions of those people who said, "There is hope. This is so beautiful." To me, it's such a small step. On the other hand, some people respond to that critique by saying, small steps are necessary. You have to start small. At least Thank God for small things. They're giving him a bracha as opposed to saying, get out of my best midrash, you're not allowed here. So that's a good thing. What's your opinion, and I'll say my own afterwards about small steps, what's your opinion about being satisfied or at least happy when there are small steps?
Yeah, I'm going to give a bit of a complicated answer because I think there is a level of appreciation for a small step, but it always has to go together with a real acknowledgement that the major issue has not been addressed. Just to explain a little bit the appreciation for the small step, believe it or not, you have more extreme voices in the Haredi community. Rav Landau, who's now considered one of the Gedolim, was critical of, I forgot his name, a Haredi Askan who's very involved in Chesed for Chayalim. I think his last name starts with a Gimel, but I can't think of it right now. And he just basically as Bittul Torah. Now, that's remarkable. Like, okay, you're not going to go to serve, at least, show concern for those who are serving. And to be fair to the Haredi community, there are groups who do so. There are groups who make barbecues and do those kind of things. And we should appreciate that is a voice we value more within the Haredi orbit. The voice that at least acknowledges the sacrifices of the Chayalim and wants to do some kind of generosity towards them. So don't want to put it down just because it's already taking a stand within Haredi discourse, and it's taking a stand we like. At the same time, I'm sympathetic to your point. It doesn't really get at the issue. At the end of the day, we don't need more barbecues. We need more chayalim. And this is something that should just be pointed out. Like, people might wonder, where were all these voices 3 years ago? October 7th and the past year has changed everything. And some of you know, there was a notion that the army could go to be, small and smart, more technology, less manpower. And okay, there was Avamina that has now turned out to be false, right? That the Hamas was able to overcome the technology in their entry. And when you have multiple fronts, I should say, in ongoing fronts, right? This is the longest war that Israel's had. We have multiple and ongoing fronts in, Gaza and Lebanon. At that point, and you need people to patrol the Shomron. At that point, you need a tremendous amount of manpower. And if you don't have enough, then the same people are going to be asked to do it again and again. So here, at the end of the day, washing clothes and bringing hamburgers, very nice. If you really want to be part of the effort, at the end of the day, really being part of the effort means you're in a uniform patrolling the border. So I would say my small move here would be acknowledging progress. And my more dominant move would be we still really haven't addressed the fundamental problem.
I would agree with that. I want to say 3 reasons that I don't think the small steps should be taken as satisfactory and enough for now, even though I acknowledge that in some ways I'm an absolutist when it comes to things like this, and perhaps I should be more flexible in my understanding. The reason that I don't think small steps are enough is, First of all, war, a situation of acute danger for Klal Yisrael. When the mitzvah of lo tamod al dam re'echa, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, and only some people are fulfilling it, and we're supposed to be satisfied, as you say, with barbecues, or, oh, he got a bracha, they're not throwing him out of the base medrash. To me, sometimes you can take small steps, and it's a process, and it'll take several years or many years, and that's okay. When there's an acute danger to Klal Yisrael, when there is a situation on our hands where everything has changed, as you just mentioned, in terms of our assumptions about the army, we may not have time for small steps, and we can't be satisfied with small steps, because if we wait and wait and wait, before long, there will be too many people who are simply absolving themselves of responsibility, which is acute today. Second of all, it's very difficult for me to celebrate small steps when this week in the Knesset, the Gimel party is trying to actually permanently make this the formal law of the land that the Haredi community, by and large, will not have to serve in the army. So if you say, hey, it's small steps, that contradicts the fact that your political leadership, people who are saying this in the Haredi world, are at the same time trying to formalize this and saying that was the last step. It's not a small step, it's the final step. And that connects to my last point. I probably will write a Substack about this, actually, because it's too long to discuss right now. But there is a danger of small steps being seen as a small step, but the person taking the small step and historically this sometimes happens, sees it as, no, I already did the job. I use this as an example, and I'll just say it very quickly. This is what I've got to talk about in more detail in writing, is when in 1965 at Vatican II, the Catholic Church formally said that there was no charge of deicide against the Jewish people. A lot of people said that that statement did not go far enough. There's a lot more that needs to be done. In Gary Will's book, Papal Sin, he talks about this extensively. It was seen as the first step by those people. Okay, this isn't enough. We need to do more than simply say Jews are not guilty of killing God. There's a lot more that needs to be said why Christians would have believed that and why that's a problem, how anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism in the Catholic Church has been a long-standing problem. And therefore, this is good only as a first step. On the other hand, later on, especially when it came to We Remember, the Vatican statement about the Shoah, which largely absolved or almost entirely absolved itself of any wrongdoing, people said, yeah, we already took care of it in that statement in 1965. In other words, what was seen by some as, okay, at least it's a small step, was seen by others, the defenders of the status quo, to be the final step. What do you mean? We already took care of that. Why do we have to talk about it anymore? And that's my fear, lahavdil, that when we're talking about small steps, sometimes what initially is seen as a step in the right direction is seen by those people who have a vested interest in keeping the status quo as, what do you mean? Didn't you see the picture of the Rebbe giving a soldier a bracha? Don't you see all the barbecues that we do for the soldiers? We totally respect the soldiers. What some had seen as a first step may perhaps be seen by those with a vested interest in keeping things as they are as not the first step, but the final step, as in, we're done already. We did it. We're finished. All right, Rabbi Blau, we're coming close to the end. I want to ask you about that legislation that's currently on its way through the Knesset, at least potentially. In order for that legislation to pass, it requires obviously a lot more than the Haredi parties, who are powerful, but not nearly that powerful. Yaakov Katz, the former editor of the Jerusalem Post, had a tweet right before Shabbos, which actually was my impetus for reaching out to you, where he talked about the egregious nature of various Likud politicians who served in the army in very high-up positions, who know that the army cannot afford this, and yet are tacitly supporting this by keeping their mouth shut and presumably in the future voting for it. In addition, it's not just Likud, it's even Tzionut Hadatit, the religious Zionist party, led by Bezalel Smotrich, and Ben Gvir's party, Otzma Yehudit, both of which are religious Zionist parties on some level. And they are also supporting this legislation, even though, as I understand it, it goes against their very foundational beliefs.
So this is a very important point. And I think there are two levels. On one level, you might just say it's the desire to stay in power, right? It is purely the sense that, oh, we're excited that we have a very right-wing government, and we'll do whatever we can to stay in power, even if it means enacting legislation we actually don't agree with. I think you definitely get that with Likud members, and maybe if Gideon Sa'ar ends up voting in favor of it, for him too, and maybe also for people from the Tzionut Datit. I do think there's another possibility here, and I hope I actually will have an article about this in Makori Shown this Friday. So take a look this Friday. Argue that a lot of the Tzionut Datit politicians are not from the mainstream Dati Lumi; they're from the Chardal world. And I argue there that the Chardal world is much closer to the Haredim than we realize. And if they're much closer to the Haredim, for them, it might not be all pragmatic politics. It might be really a sense of ideological kinship, which I think would be a very important point if that's true. So maybe those of you take a look, read my article, see if you agree. And I think what I'd like to happen is I think the Dati Leumi mainstream should reject this. And in two ways, we should all write to them, write to Smotrich and Rotman about how we're not in favor of this Chok HaGiyus, and quite frankly, politically punish them if they pass it. Right? It should be clear, okay, if this is what you guys really stand for, we're not voting for you in the next election. Well, and by the way, it doesn't mean you have to go like super left. There are plenty of other right-wing voices out there, but not one that has to support, Haredi exemption. And either way, whether it's pragmatic politics or ideology, I think it's very problematic.
Okay, Rabbi Blau, a lot of my listeners are not in Israel. In fact, the majority of them, the good majority of them, are not in Israel, even though we do have a sizable component of listeners here. A lot of them may be saying, okay, I agree with what you're saying. Everything you said makes sense, or a lot of what you said makes sense, but I don't live there. There's nothing I can do about this anyway, because I'm not Israeli. And frankly, as a non-Israeli, even if I believe in the army, I'm not serving in the army either. My kid isn't serving in the army either in many cases. So for people who are listening who are not Israeli, who agree with the position that you and I have articulated today, what would you tell them to do? Is there any action point that they should be doing or idea that they should take in other than being mad at Israeli Haredim?
You're right. Being mad usually is not such a productive endeavor. The one thing I could really think of is, where you put your finances. What do you donate to? And I think a great example happened recently. You know, if there is no law giving Haredim an exemption, so the Haredim lose many financial benefits as a result of that. And I don't know if you recall this, but there was like Gadol trip to America to raise, I think raise maybe
I think it was $100 million, if I recall, something like that.
Right, $100 million, right? Okay, so now again, I imagine most Haredi American are not going to listen to me. But if you really think that the world has to change, actually, you should be giving them money, right? It may well be that the factor that will most change the Israeli Haredi community is economic pressure. That's normal. That's the way humanity is. That's a very strong force in the world. So if there's really a sense that, coal guys won't be able to pay for Mahon and yeshiva won't be able to pay for Ter, so that will force some kind of change. So certainly, I think if you're a modern Orthodox Zionist, I don't think this is the time to be giving to the mir. And even maybe, America has more moderate Haredim. So maybe some of the more moderate Haredim in America will rethink, is this the place they want to give their money right now? That would be my best advice for how to make any contribution. Give it to the IDF. Give it to causes that help Chayalim.
Okay, Rabbi Blau, do you have any final thoughts you want to present before we close for the day?
Okay, now I like to not be melodramatic and not to use emotions. I feel they could be manipulative. But once in a while, I think one can make an exception. Okay, I think I would close. Let's get beyond all the halachic material, all the hashkafic material, all the sociological material. Let me just say as follows. I live in a lone shvut. I learned in Yeshivat Har Zion, which is in my neighborhood. Over the last year, I might be getting the numbers a bit wrong, but let's say 8 boys from a lone shvut have been killed. And many boys, either who learned in Har Zion or some of the children of Bogrim from Har Zion, I don't know the exact number, have been killed as well. I have a son who, unfortunately, very recently, just 3 days ago, a very fine boy named Alon Safrai was killed in Lebanon. Alon Safrai learned in Chorev with my oldest son. We learned in Gush with my oldest son. And even was on a championship football team in 12th grade with my oldest son. Right? So he's someone that my son knows quite well, and he was killed. Meaning we are seeing deaths of people we know all around us. And many people also know that the Dati Leumi community is overrepresented in the fatalities beyond its population. And for good reasons, because this community is willing to be kravi. This community is willing to do miluim. Now, again, I don't mean chas v'shalom that more liberal or secular communities don't. They do also. But it's still true that the religious Zionist community is overrepresented. I would turn to my Haredi peers and say, one community that's experiencing death all the time. Nobody dies on the way to the Beis Medrash. Nobody perishes in the Beis Medrash. So when you're thinking about the chiluk tafkidim, as it were, the division of labor, ask yourself, who is truly sacrificing and who is not?
Then, Rabbi Blau, I'm going to ask one more question in response to that, only because I've heard some people say, when people like me and you have said that argument, they say, are you asking for more Haredim to die? Do you want more Haredim to die? Is that what you mean? How would you respond to that?
Look, nobody wants anyone to die. But we would like, in a community of solidarity, that people should take on equal risks. Right? That's the nature of difficult situations. Right? I don't want anyone to die. And if you tell me, what if only, I know, Filonim died and not Dati Leumi, would I be happy? No, I would not be happy in the slightest. But I do want, if people feel they're part of the game and they're responsible for Am Yisrael, we should all be equally involved in the risk-taking.
Rabbi Yitzchak Blau, thank you very much for joining me today and talking about this important topic.
Thank you. It is indeed a crucial topic right now.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers. And you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.